Welcome to Insights Equestrium and our exciting discussion today. I'm Pete Howard, Executive Director of the Digital Business Institute here at Boston University's Equestrium School of Business. Our topic today is performance in the Privacy Sandbox, publisher revenue, and advertiser conversions in the Chrome experiment. First, a little housekeeping. We'd love to have an active Q&A with all of you today, so here's how it works. Questions can be submitted down the bottom in the Q&A box the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer them after the material presentation. So with us today is Garrett Johnson, Associate Professor of Marketing. Garrett researches digital marketing, measuring its effectiveness and examining its privacy issues. His ad effectiveness research uses large-scale experiments to measure how and how much ads work. His privacy research both examines the impact of Europe's GDPR and studies policy trade-offs in online behavioral targeting. For his work, Professor Johnson has been awarded the Paul Green Award and has been a finalist for both the John D.C. Little Award and the Gary Lillian Marketing Science Practice Prize. And we're also proud to have Garrett as a research fellow at the Digital Business Institute. So welcome, Garrett.
Thanks very much for hosting this.
Welcome. It's great to have you. So as you start your presentation, Garrett, let's jump right in. Can you remind us, though, what are cookies, why are they important, and what's changing?
So third-party cookies are kind of the linchpin of how modern digital advertising works. They are just a text file. So it's just a text file that your browser downloads that has an identifier. And it's not going to say Pete Howard. It's going to say, ABC123. And when that gets stitched together across the website that Pete and others visit, this allows marketers to understand who sees ads and then subsequently purchases, and also get a little bit of a sense of what are people's interests so they can better target ads. So this is a very broadly useful technology, but it's one that's created some privacy concerns. Right. And so various regulators and ad platforms have thought of ways to try to get rid of these technologies or update them to be more privacy protective. And so today I'm going to talk about one such proposal from Google called the Privacy Sandbox that tries to do just that. And this proposal is quite mature, and so we're going to see just how well it performs. Go ahead.
No, exciting. Can't wait to see it.
All right, so to dive in then, we are going to provide an update on the latest news on Privacy Sandbox, talk about the latest data on adoption of these technologies by the industry, and then, as promised by the title, talk about the experimental results to see the impact of Privacy Sandbox on publisher revenue as well as advertiser performance. So to dive right in with the Privacy Sandbox, I'm going to assume that many people in this audience are pretty familiar with Privacy Sandbox. This is like the third one of these that I've done, but I want to, remind people a little bit of what these things are. So Privacy Sandbox is a collection of technologies that aim to preserve the benefits of cross-site and cross-app identity, which I just talked about in my response to Pete, ability to have better targeted ads that generate more money that's shared with publishers and other people in the industry. So to have these benefits in online advertising while improving privacy protection for users. So Pete asked me this question, like, what are cookies? And it's really important because cookies are a silver bullet technology. If you know who a user is across contexts, then you can do many things like reduce fraud and help measure ad effectiveness and better target ads. And when you get rid of these silver bullet technologies, I guess very smart people at Google and elsewhere have solved this problem by basically recreating separate technologies that do, each one of the jobs that cookies used to do. So there's technologies for ad targeting, there's technologies for measurement to reduce fraud. A big part of the Privacy Sandbox is various technologies to make the browser more privacy protective and prevent covert tracking. So today we're going to be focused on the targeting APIs, talking about Topics API and Protected Audience API, but that's kind of a big picture introduction to Privacy Sandbox. Now, in terms of the update, Google has repeatedly postponed its third-party cookie deprecation. So most recently postponed this until 2025. I think it was slated for all of 2022, 23, 24, and 25, but it keeps getting pushed off. And it gets pushed off because this is hard and there's many stakeholders involved. Now, the big news was that a couple months ago, Google actually backed off of deprecating third-party cookies, but said that they would make users decide whether they would accept third-party cookies. So we don't know exactly what that involves or how that would be approached, but we do know from the announcement that Google characterizes their approach as letting people make an informed choice that applies across their web browsing, and they'd be able to adjust that choice at any time. So functionally, that means that we expect users to be presented with some choice about whether you want cookies or not. Probably that choice is going to be pretty sticky, and it's not going to be one that's repeated on all websites. At least that's how I read that sentence. So this kind of changed the news, and we'll talk a little bit about just, to what extent it changed things. But in response, the CMA, which is the British Competition Authority that has been monitoring Privacy Sandbox, and I guess I should disclose that I'm serving as an outside expert for, so what I have to say is not representative of their views. But they delayed their quarterly update in July. This is all public information. They asked stakeholders, what do you think of this new change from Google? So that was the big news. And I think the other news that's interesting for people that are studying this space is that many industry participants publicly released the results from their experiment with Chrome's Privacy Sandbox, which ran for the first half of 2024. And so we have a diverse set of views trying to quantify how well this performed from Criteo, from Google, from Index Exchange, from Nextroll, and from myself. And so I'll share the results that we have with you today. And some of you were around a few months ago when we provided the early results. Okay, so I think a big question is if Google pushes this decision to users, what does that look like? And I think this picture from eMarketer helps kind of think through what that change looks like. So the bottom line of this picture is that they estimate that 87% of US browsers would be cookieless in 2025 when these changes come to fruition. And basically how they get there is they say, let me turn on my little laser pointer here. So Firefox and Safari, they already block third-party cookies. They have for a while. They'll continue to do that. Microsoft Edge has said that they will block third-party cookies, so that gets lumped in there too. And then the big choice then is Chrome, which is the largest browser. The share of cookieless users is going to vary by how many Chrome users consent to keeping third-party cookies. And so eMarketer has chosen 17% of users consenting. And, that's no private information. I think that's just their estimate. I would hazard a guess that they came up with that number by looking at the consent rates that Apple gets in its iOS devices for app tracking transparency, ATT. That number looks like the sort of number you get in iOS ATT. So, you may believe that number is too small or too big, and so you could adjust that number accordingly, but I think that helps us fix ideas. So, you see the share of users with cookies is going to go down quite a lot. Now, Scott Messer points out, and that's sort of how I found this slide or this data from eMarketer, that this is a little bit of an oversimplification because actually a bunch of users in Chrome today are already missing cookies or restricting cookies for privacy reasons. And so the share of cookieless browsers, at least in the US today, is closer to 58% than this 37%. But regardless, we're going, I think, from a tipping point of, arguably the majority of the slim majority of browsers being cookieless to the vast majority of browsers being cookieless sometime in 2025. So one thing that we've been tracking for some time with help from several funders, including the Digital Business Institute, is what websites are actually using these technologies. And so what we've been doing is we've been following this panel of about 60,000 top commercial websites with the help of Sincera. Sincera is a startup in this space that scans websites and identifies how they use various ad tech technologies, among other things. And so we're able to get a sense of who's using these targeting APIs, protected audience and topics. And all this data is public. So someone could potentially help me by putting that in the dashboard, or I can do that a bit later. But I'll go through the data quickly. So first, we're going to look at the protected audience or POPI adoption. And what's interesting about POPI is that it really changes how digital advertising works from, taking a user's cookie ID and sharing that potentially broadly with a lot of advertisers and intermediaries, to making all of the ad tech companies come to your browser. And so the way that works is when an advertiser wants to show you ads on other websites like Macy's, they'll add you to an interest group via your browser. And then when you go to a website like a publisher like the Washington Post, they can tell your browser that they want to run an auction to select among your various interest groups and show you a targeted ad. With the idea being that then we can have targeted ads based on your browsing behavior, but that browsing behavior stays private. It doesn't leave your browser. And from a data perspective, this is kind of nice because then we can see websites that are adding users to interest groups and websites that are adding users to these auctions or running these auctions. So first, I'm going to show you the share of websites that in a given month are adding users to a protected audience interest group over time. This was pretty steady in 2023, and then there was a ramp up around 2024. One unfortunate thing is that for a period of about 5 months, we weren't able to see Criteo because they were blocking traffic coming from servers like our scanners. But we get back to seeing the whole picture as of April, and you see, the growth starts to slow a little bit, and it's, stayed pretty constant in July and August. And that's around the time that Google has pumped the brakes a little bit on the proposal to get rid of third-party cookies. So we see the growth seems to have leveled out here a little bit. We can also look at the other side of the market and look at the share of websites that are running auctions. And since February, we've been able to see the lion's share because we were able to see Google. And the share of these websites has varied from about 13% up to 18%. It's relatively flat. It's maybe trending upwards a little bit. But the big grain of salt that you should keep in mind here is that the top level seller, so the in some sense the agent that's making the decision to run these auctions, is almost 90% of the time Google. So maybe Google has a different perspective on these technologies than maybe some other vendors in the marketplace. But we do see some others, and the largest being SeedTag at about 4.5%, actually running these auctions. So then looking at Topics API adoption, we see, so first of all, Topics API is this notion that the browser can help target people based on their interests by looking at the websites that they visit in a week, picking out the topics that are sort of relevant and that are most visited by the website, and sharing some of them at random with ad tech companies. So that when you go to a website like a news website, we can find out that Pete's interested in tennis, and Garrett, being a Canadian, is interested in hockey. And so we can better show targeted ads to people even when they're on generic content. So that's the idea of topics. One of the virtues of topics
Hey, Garrett.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, excuse me. A relevant question just came in to a couple slides back. Question is, are the counts for individual interest groups, or are the counts that you reference for individual interest groups, or are those the counts for the participants participating in the groups?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So this is its share of sites in both cases. So that means that if we look at over here, 13.3% of these 60,000 websites that we're tracking added a user to any one interest group. And we think that probably some websites add users to a lot of interest groups or add them to them with a lot of regularity. And so we're not kind of adding more votes to people that are, or websites that are using these technologies more heavily. We're just saying, do you ever use it within a month? So that's, probably especially useful for these auctions, which we know from other data are run a minority of the time. So the fact we're able to see this, visit a website maybe 30 times in a month or even more, this makes it more likely we're actually able to detect these auctions running.
Good.
Okay, so very good question. So then doing the same thing for Topics API, you see that the Topics API adoption is quite a bit higher. So it's maxed out around 41%. It started to fall a little bit. Unfortunately, I only have the data from July. But I think, the strength here is that Topics API is very easy to use. There's no kind of re-architecting about how all of ad tech works. And so that probably favors adoption. It would be, hopefully I'll have the data for August here in the next week, but maybe we're seeing here a little bit of a softening in the wake of Google's third-party cookie consent deprecation announcement. But we do see the market shares for vendors here. So there was a question earlier about how these things are defined. So basically what we're doing is we're saying, well, we'll take all the websites that Google is showing up on for topic calls, as well as all the websites that each one of these things are showing up on. And then we'll just take, Google divided by the whole to get a market share of 21%. OpenX divided by the whole is 15.5. Criteo is third place, Rubicon is fourth, and then Taboola is 5, followed by Pugmatic, RTB House, and a few others. So I think this is revealing, right? We get a little bit of sense of which companies are prioritizing which technologies, and to what extent they're gaining coverage with these websites. So I think there's a lot of industry people in this audience that will recognize some of these names and especially find these shares interesting. And then last but not least, websites can also opt out of topics. And we're pretty flat at around 1.2% of websites saying that they don't want to participate. Okay, so now I want to get to the actual title of this talk, which is seeing how well this stuff performs. I think the content we covered to this point is going to help us understand these results because we've seen that the adoption of these technologies is kind of soft. So there's maybe a ceiling on how much we can move the needle here. But this is from joint work with Jengrong Gu, who's a PhD student here at Questrom, and Shunto Kobayashi, who we just hired actually a couple months ago. He's a great former student out of Caltech. So we want to see, how well these technologies perform in practice. And towards that, we're going to leverage this really ambitious industry-wide and global experiment to help us get a sense on the industry side and on the regulator side about how well these things perform. I think this is going to be a really hard exercise for a long list of reasons. But one of the biggest problems is that, we would like to understand how Privacy Sandbox works in the long-term future or in a long-term future where the technologies are broadly adopted and the kinks are worked out and there's sort of everything is humming. But what we're going to measure is going to be, a product of the adoption in this current time and also the industry's investment in these tools in the current time. And so, we think this is sort of directionally informative, but doesn't tell us what we really want to know, which is, again, a chicken and egg problem, because if everybody knew that this stuff worked really well, then we'd already be using these technologies. So one nice thing is that we are working with a couple of companies, one on the publisher side and one on the advertiser side. So we get to look at a view of over 1,000 publishers and over 1,000 advertisers, like how well these things work. And the foundation of this experiment is that 2% of Chrome users are randomized into 3 main groups. I like to call these groups by English names rather than the names that the CMA and Google chose, because I think it's clearer. So what I call the status quo group are the people that have third-party cookies still turned on, Privacy Sandbox basically turned off. That's 1% of users. And then we're interested in what happens with the Privacy Sandbox. And so this group will turn third-party cookies off. They'll turn Privacy Sandbox on, and they're about 0.75% of users. And then our final group are these cookieless users that have neither. So third-party cookies are turned off and Privacy Sandbox is turned off as well. And that's only 0.25% of Chrome users. So this experiment is you know, it's interesting that this is communicated to absolutely everybody in the industry that wants to pay attention to it. It's forced upon the user through technical means. So we kind of get a clear sense of what's happening in these three cases. And also, we kind of have two benchmarks to measure Privacy Sandbox performance. We can compare it to how things are today versus how things are in the future, where we just get rid of third-party cookies and don't replace it with anything. And so, what we're going to talk about today in terms of performance is basically grading Privacy Sandbox on a curve, so to speak, of basically where do they lie between this benchmark down here and this benchmark up here. Okay, so on the publisher side, our partner is public. It's Raptive. And Raptive is an outstanding partner for a list of reasons. One is that they're really large. So they're the largest ad management company. So functionally, their business model is they'll go to a publisher and they'll say, you want to run ads on your website to make money. Ad tech is really complicated, but we will take care of everything. And you'll pay us some cut of the revenue that you get from advertising, but we will take care of everything for you. So they're so large that collectively all of their properties would represent a top 10 property on ComScore's US list. This means that they have about almost 200 million monthly site visitors across well over 5,000 US creators, many more websites. And they skew towards the categories of food, home, lifestyle, family, and travel. Collectively, they would rank very high in those categories. But yes, it's kind of a very broad group of publishers and a very broad group of categories is included here. So the data we get from them is the revenue per impression, and we also get that tied to experimental labels. And so we have a really nice view of the revenue associated in these three different groups. And I think a really nice advantage of this is that we get to see all of the publishers' revenue. So we get like a 360-degree view of their publisher revenue. And that's important because if you only have one ad tech company's view of the data, then the challenge is that the market conditions are going to be different in these three different groups. And so you're going to be seeing a different proportion of activity in these three different groups. And that would kind of break the experiment, which is predicated on an apples-to-apples comparison between these three different groups. So by being able to see everything, we're able to actually cleanly talk about what happens with Privacy Sandbox. Now, I say that, but there's actually kind of one limitation of this data, which is that prior to August, we didn't observe all the revenue associated with Privacy Sandbox. That seems important. So specifically, the earlier data omitted Poppy revenue from what's called a non-Google component auction seller, which in English is, I've explained that there's these Poppy auctions. I did not explain, though, that there could be a mini auction that goes up to that auction. And so one of these mini auctions, if it's controlled by Google, if they win the whole auction, then Google's very large ad seller, which is Google Ad Manager, doesn't report that back to the publisher. Now, Google Ad Manager knew this was an issue. They said they're going to fix it, and they fixed it in August. And so I'll be able to show you some data for what that looks like. So let's take a look. So now we're looking at August 1st to August 31st. We get to see all the revenue. And here I've just showing you the indexed revenue per impression for these three different groups. So status quo is indexed at 100%. And when we get rid of third-party cookies and go to this cookie list group, then ad prices fall by 28%. And when we get rid of cookies and replace them with Sandbox, the news gets a little better. So now ad prices only fall by 25%. So again, we're kind of grading Sandbox on this curve, which is, between getting rid of cookies and the status quo, how much of the gap is closed. So that's, an additional 3% of revenue over this 28% gap is what we call the recovery share. So the recovery share is 11% of the revenue lost from losing cookies. So probably nobody's doing cartwheels at this moment. That's not a lot. But I will show you in a few slides that the news gets worse in some ways and better in others. I guess the sense is that it's better is that, if no one were to use Privacy Sandbox, then recovery share would be 0. And we haven't seen a world where everybody's using Privacy Sandbox. That recovery share should be higher. So I'm showing you the data from August. Now it's worth looking back and sort of seeing how this evolves over time. So I think I last gave this talk in March and I said, hey, it's looking like it's about 8%. And I guess at the time, what I thought was, well, it's 8% now, but it's still kind of early days. And we know that a lot of companies are running experiments, and those companies are probably going to do things a little bit at the last minute. And so maybe in May and June, we'll see something increase. And we kind of do. We see an increase in June, a little bit of a decrease in May, but we see an increase in June, which is, not, I guess, relative to this is significant, but is not massive, which I guess, speaks to, again, just the fact that not a ton of companies are adopting this. And we see a little bit of a leveling off since then, getting down to 11%. All this is with the caveat that everything until July was missing some of the revenue, but we did some digging based on the sort of data that we could get, and as far as we could tell, missing that data was not dramatically changing the results. It's just not enough dollars going through non-Google components auctions, and the prices were not too different. So we probably aren't missing a whole lot here. So yes, I guess the update is that there's maybe not as much of an update as I anticipated could be possible. Now I did say that the news does get bad in a couple of ways. I think one thing that has received a lot of attention is that, taking all of ad tech and placing it on the user's device to improve privacy has a downside, and that downside is that these auctions tend to take more time. And so the word for this is latency. Latency is just the time that elapses between when the user loads the page and when the ad actually shows up. We don't want that latency to be too long, because if the latency is too long, then the ad may not load, or it may be less effective. And in any case, the publisher may make less money. So this plot is showing you the whole distribution of these things, but I think it's more clear to just focus on the 75th percentile. So the 75th percentile for cookie lists is 2.5 seconds. So put another way, that means 75% of all auctions in the cookie list group the ads load in 2.5 seconds or less, which is pretty fast. But in the Sandbox group, that more than doubles. So it takes 5.3 seconds for the ad to load. And in the status quo group, you might think, well, these use cookies, so maybe that'll slow things down too. It slows things down a little, but it's still 2.66 seconds, pardon me, 2.66 seconds. So the cookie lists and status quo groups are kind of on top of each other. And the Sandbox group is kind of larger everywhere. And at the 71st percentile, it's pretty material difference. And this panel on the right then breaks the Sandbox group into the ads that are eventually sold via Poppy and the ones that are sold via Poppy and the ones that aren't. So if it's not sold via Poppy, the 75th percentile is 5.11 seconds. And if it is sold via Poppy, then the delay is 8.3 seconds. So this is kind of an eternity in ad tech terms, right? If it takes 8.3 seconds to the ad to load, then that's a concern. And even if it's not sold by Poppy, well, the Poppy sale could be still, or Poppy auction could still be run to generate a price to compare to something else. And that still seems to be slowing things down more than in the cookieless and status quo groups. So, I think this has been quantified by other people, so I don't think there's any big surprises here, but, this is quantified using a lot of data from Raptive. What is new is that if the latency is too high, then the ads don't load. And if the ads don't load, then publishers earn no money. And so a big question is like, well, how big is this problem? Like, how many ads are not loading? And it's kind of hard to study missing data because it's not there to study. But we peg this figure at 3.1% of impressions. So we're saying we think that the Privacy Sandbox makes it so that 3.1% fewer ads load on the page. And, how do we get that? Well, essentially, we see the counts of the number of impressions in each group. And if we go back here, we know the size of each of these three groups. And what our data is telling us is that there's 3% too few impressions in the Privacy Sandbox group relative to the other groups. Which, probably is kind of intuitive given what we're showing over here, so it doesn't seem crazy. But, that is material in terms of revenue. And it's material because, the figures I showed you a couple slides ago and the figures I showed you a few months ago, we're assuming that we were seeing, all of the revenue associated with these impressions and looking at the average revenue per impressions. But this is going to overestimate Privacy Sandbox's benefit because it's admitting that 3.1% of users, or sorry, 3.1% of impressions yield no revenue. And so when you redo the numbers, then the revised recovery shares falls to only 2.8% rather than 11%. Because again, the math is down here, we haven't accounted for these missing impressions. So to kind of summarize this point in mean form, as a publisher, you want that recovery share to be positive and to traverse that distance between getting rid of cookies and maintaining the status quo. And you're making some progress there, but that progress is being held back by the fact that fewer impressions are rendering.
Hey, Garrett.
Now, yeah, please.
Quick question. Well, an audience question for clarification first, and I have another question. These studies, US or is it global or international?
This is global.
It's global. Okay.
Yeah, all the data I'm showing you is global. The adoption statistics, we drop some countries' websites like from Russia and China, but all the experiment data is global.
Right. And so, and my question, and we've talked about this before, and I certainly have my own thoughts, but for the audience, like, why does this matter? So, why do we care that publishers and websites make revenue from advertising, in terms of competition and sort of a customer experience, and potentially maybe at the expense of customer experience, or maybe it's benefit, I would argue, but why is the study indexing on publisher revenue?
Yeah, so we're looking at the impact of ad technology. And one of the big consequences of that is that ads help to fund the open web and fund, I guess, even the walled gardens on the web. So, the content and services that we enjoy, whether it be, targeted ads on Facebook or, our favorite hockey blog or mom blog, parenting blog, those people are usually paid at the end of the day by advertising. And, the results here suggesting that ads fall like 30% without
Right.
cookies. I mean, that's actually better news than I'd previously found in my own research. And
Right.
Google found in their own research, they found it was more like a 50% reduction. So regardless, if you're, if most of us, I'm sure we work very hard, but if our boss told us tomorrow that if we were going to get paid 30% or 50% less tomorrow, maybe we wouldn't work quite as hard.
Right.
So, and that would mean like there's less
Conversely,
content that we get to enjoy for free, right? So
right.
that's the thing where everybody's worried about.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a rhetorical question, but I think it's so important to remember, right? That that's what makes the web free, is free to us anyway, is the ad revenue, but also, if done right, and I'm a proponent of all the targeting you can get, the ads are relevant to us, and we should not hate them, right? Let alone maybe click on them.
Yeah, I mean, I teach digital marketing, so it's hard for me to disagree with you too much. Obviously, there's some people that think that privacy is really important, maybe even more important than, these publishers getting paid this extra 30 or 50%. But the hope is that it's possible to have our cake and eat it too, to be able to, have privacy, at least some definition of privacy in the Privacy Sandbox, but have, numbers that are closer to this than to this. And so, yeah, that's sort of trying to have your cake and eat it too. Of course, there's always trade-off in life, and that's what we're hopeful to try to explore with this kind of research. But that's kind of the big picture idea of what we're trying to balance here. And thanks for zooming us out, Pete. That's a really good point. I wanted to say one last thing, and then Pete, if you have more questions about publishers, but if not, I'll go to the advertiser side. So, it's not ordained by God that poppy auctions have to take a really long time. I'm not a technical expert on this, but my understanding is that this can be run more efficiently if the auctions are run in parallel with the other decisions that an ad server or ad decisioning mechanism is going to be making. And I think part of what's slowing this down is that these auctions have been run in sequence. And so, as you go through that sequence, that's just going to take more time. And some technical people have demonstrated that you can get faster. I think one potential worry is that as more companies participate in this space, that could start to slow these things down again. But that it's all to say that like this problem is consequential, and there's some suggestions that it can be improved. Okay, so Pete, do you have any questions, or I should talk about the advertiser side?
Well, we have a question that came through from the
Great.
average, probably going to answer this from the advertising point of view. Does impression loss have implications or change how we evaluate ad performance under Privacy Sandbox?
From an advertiser perspective?
Yes, from an advertiser perspective.
That's a good question. I mean, I would think, the good news for advertisers is that like if the ads don't load, if it's latency issues or ad blocker or whatever, if the ads don't load, you don't have to pay for that. So that's maybe makes it a little less of a concern. But, advertising is showing people small pictures on the web when they're trying to do other things with their lives. And so if that picture shows up, 8 seconds later instead of 2.5 seconds later, then it's, less likely that we're going to notice it, pay attention, and it's going to influence our behavior. So I think that's, latency is something the publisher should care a lot about, but advertisers are trying to, influence people's behaviors, and, showing people a blank screen for 8.5 seconds is not going to.
And since most are on cost per click versus just impressions, it to your point, doesn't matter to them. Or should. Great. All right.
Cool. So then switching to the advertiser side. So we're going to work with the DSP that represents a lot of advertisers. DSP in English is a demand side platform. So it's just an ad tech company that advertisers work with to buy ads, because ads are hard to buy. This stuff runs very quickly. And so what we're going to look at here is we're going to look at the total advertiser outcomes per week in terms of clicks, click-through conversions, and conversions. We're going to focus on the first two of those things really today, broken apart by these three experimental groups. And so this data, if you ever pulled into Google Analytics, this is the sort of data that you get in Google Analytics, right? It shows you the total, clicks and click-through conversions associated with the advertisements that you're running. What we're sort of upgrading to that is we're going to also break it down by these 3 experimental groups. The one big advantage here is that we're looking across 2,000 advertisers globally. So I was previously asked, where is this data coming from? It's coming from all over the world. And all of these advertisers are running retargeted campaigns, which means, these are sort of ads that follow us around the web when we see a pair of shoes that we are interested in but don't purchase, and then kind of follow us around the internet. So the big advantage of doing things in this way is that it tells us the incremental lift in conversions when we use Sandbox versus status quo. And I guess putting that more directly, this experiment is kind of weird in that running this experiment affects your ability to measure the outcomes. So if you're an advertiser and you're measuring, the effects on your click-through conversions, well, third-party cookies have been very useful for you to measure these things. And that's going to go away in the groups of the experiment that lose cookies. So by kind of rolling up to this higher level Google Analytics data, we're able to get around that. But the disadvantage is that our estimates are going to be very imprecise, even though we're looking at 2,000 advertisers for 5 months, because we're only looking at 2% of Chrome traffic in our experiment. So let's see what happens. So first of all, we're going to look at the status quo clicks, which we've indexed to 1, and see what happens when we get rid of cookies. So when we get rid of cookies, we go to something like this, which is a reduction of almost 90%. And some of you might be thinking, well, retargeting relies on cookies, so why doesn't it fall 100%? And that's what we thought would happen, and that's what we expected to happen. But some publishers did this little trick called ID bridging, where when Google zeroed out all the users in this group's cookies, they said, well, we still know who this user is because we have a one-on-one relationship or a first-party relationship with these people. And so we can reconstitute those third-party cookie IDs and pass them through the bid stream or the ad selling process to the advertisers. Now, depending on who you ask, this is all either being really, really helpful or engaging in fraud. But to kind of put a figure on this, about 90% of this goes away, and about 10% in terms of clicks is associated with this technique called ID bridging, and it declines over time. So that's what happens with cookieless. And then what happens with Sandbox is that, well, you can still continue to buy these impressions through your existing ad system, just like you were with these cookieless because of ID bridging. But now you turn on Poppy. So you turn on this weight of impressions or clicks in this case, which is associated with this new Privacy Sandbox technologies. And here, now the number of clicks is only falling by 47% instead of 88%. And so again, if we're going to use this recovery share to quantify, how much is Sandbox recovering the gap between here and here, now the news is much better. It's 46% rather than, on the publisher side, we saw it was 11%. Now, if you're eagle-eyed, you may think that the pictures and the numbers don't quite line up, and that's a little bit of fibbing going on because I'm using figures from March to now, but these numbers are coming from February to now. And I just did that because I think it's easier to kind of see these, get an intuition for what's going on by seeing the blue and the red bars. So the recovery share is much better for clicks. We can also look at click-through conversions. So conversions is when you typically buy or perform some activity of interest to the advertiser. And click-through conversions are those conversions that come from users that clicked on an ad to arrive at that website. So the picture is pretty much the same. So without cookies, this falls by 89%. And with Poppy turned on in Privacy Sandbox, it falls by 50%. for a recovery share of, again, about 44%. So at this point, you may be asking yourself, like, what is it with Poppy that we're only getting like half the way up the tree here instead of all the way up the tree? Is there something here that's wrong or broken? And so I think the critical thing that we're missing here is the actual number of ads that people are seeing and the spending that's happening in these groups. So now I'm going to fill that in and show you the clicks, click-through conversions, impressions, and ad spend. And now you can see, there's there's a decline of about half, or about 50%, in the number of impressions in total in this group, and about the same in terms of ad spend. So what we think is going on here is not that like Poppy is just not able to get all the way up the tree here. It's more that there's just not enough of these impressions in the marketplace at current spend levels. And so because of that, and that reflects the data I showed you earlier, just not everybody's running these auctions, you're generating less performance. So I think a pretty natural thing to do would then be to normalize clicks and normalize click-through conversions by impressions and by ad spend. So that's in fact what we do here. And we find that now the relationships are much closer to 1-to-1. Not quite there yet, but Poppy is getting something like 80 or 90% of the clicks per dollar. Same with clicks per impression, conversions per dollar, and conversions per impression. So the news is much better at this point. Once you do that normalization. And again, what we think is happening here is that there's just not enough inventory of Poppy auctions in the first half of 2024. And that puts a ceiling on how much you can get from a recovery share. Now, you may still be concerned that this is, closer to 90 or 80% than 100%. I think one thing to keep in mind is that like the classic system here has been tuned over the course of many years, right? But the Poppy thing, this way of buying has only been working for, a matter of months or a little over a year. So there still is like scope to improve this. But it's much closer to this kind of recovery share of 100% that we'd like. And I think the last thing I'll say about this is that another thing we can do is we can look at advertisers in different countries that vary by the share of Privacy Sandbox impressions. And again, we see this correlation suggesting that like what's putting a ceiling on this is the low supply of Poppy inventory. So let me pause there before concluding. Are there any questions about this?
Garrett, I have several questions sort of across a few topics. Maybe I suggest you kind of bring it home and then we can go through some Q&A.
Perfect. Thanks, Pete. Great. So we've got 10 minutes for that. So just to conclude, Privacy Sandbox adoption seems to have leveled off somewhat after Google's revised plans to punt the decision to deprecate third-party cookies to the user. The experimental results show that directionally, advertisers can obtain similar performance per dollar or per impression with Privacy Sandbox, albeit when they're doing retargeting, and Privacy Sandbox has a 1-to-1 solution for retargeting. We see that Privacy Sandbox modestly improves publisher revenue, but that is somewhat undercut by these significant latency issues that cause these impressions to be dropped. And the other result is that, the soft adoption of this market restricts the performance on both the publisher side and the advertiser side. And so there are significant scope for increased industry adoption and increased adaptation to these tools and investment in these tools to improve publisher and advertiser side outcomes. But, we're looking at a future where we're moving from like 1% of users that have their cookies turned off in Chrome to some probably high number, something like 80%. And when you have this massive change in the marketplace, this bullet here, this scope for the industry adoption is going to change alongside that. So, there's hopefully we've learned something from the various kind of data points that help us maybe triangulate what's going on here, but there's still, a lot of open questions. So let's turn over to the Q&A then.
Great. Well, first of all, a round of applause. Great presentation, great information. Okay, let's see here. We got a lot of questions.
And I can stick around too. I don't have a hard stop,
Yep.
right? But let's try to do as many as we can for the people that want to.
So measurements. Were any measurements done on view through versus click based?
No, because we are using like Google Analytics style data, and Google Analytics style data is reliant on click-based tracking. And so you could try to do view through because Privacy Sandbox offers view through, but the cookie-based targeting and the Privacy Sandbox based targeting are not exactly the same thing. Privacy Sandbox puts some caps on the number of data, the amount of data that they will report, or the types of data they will report, and they add noise to it. So yeah, we're giving up something to kind of get these more clean results, but we are losing the view through conversions. I mean, we're able to look at all conversions. I didn't show you this, but that's just radically different because instead of looking at all these outcomes that are associated with ads, well, conversions only fall by something like 5% when you turn off ads, just because that includes all the conversions by people that don't even see ads, which is, I think, really interesting. I kind of skipped over that because, I'm already putting way too much information out there in 40 minutes. But, we have something to say about that is what I'm trying to say. Thanks.
Great. If David on from Epsilon has lots of great comments, questions, one of which is, did you use ARA for conversion measurement?
So again, we didn't here just because, what's weird about this experiment, in an experiment, you want apples to apples comparisons and you want outcomes measured the same way. And what's weird about this is that, like, by construction, we are forcing you to measure these things in one way or the other. So to get around to that, we're falling back on this more aggregate data that you would get from relying on click-based attribution alone.
Got it. Right. Okay, here's a broader question. What are your thoughts on additional impact outside of just the web? This is from Sanjeet. Believe Android-based apps are impacted, for example, removal of advertising ID. Would you expect the results to be similar?
That's a really good question. So I think, the advertiser, and especially the advertiser, and to some extent the publisher data, that's also coming from the mobile web. So we do have some sense, and I don't think it's radically different if you look across devices in terms of recovery shares. But I think an interesting question is like what happens in app advertising outside of the web on our phones. And that I don't really have data to speak to. But yeah, that's a really interesting question. There's a little bit more clarity about what's happening with the time frame of cookie deprecation relative to what's happening to the mobile ad IDs. So yeah, that's important, but something that I don't have too much to say about.
Got it. Great. I'm sure that's such a great important topic. I'm sure that'll be coming. Have a tactical question. I think I know the answer, but if somebody wanted to connect with you or I guess me afterwards, is that okay? And it's certainly okay with me. Are you okay, Garrett?
Yeah, please. I think we're both easy to find on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter. I can open the chat and I can add my information and also a link to that dashboard for people that want to follow. So let's see if
Thanks,
I can grab
Jason,
everyone.
for that. Yeah, we're certainly reachable and available. When you say 80% cookie deprecation, is that users shutting off their cookies? And is it a trust issue? Or is it, because I think it's publishers turning them off, right? Because they have to.
No, so again, going back to the beginning of our story here, Google said, we're going to, instead of killing all third-party cookies, we're going to ask users, what do you think? Do
That's
you
right.
want to keep cookies or do you want to turn them off? And, you know, we've seen historically that the share of people that turn off cookies varies a lot by how you frame that question, and to what extent you put those things on even footing. And from Apple's experience, we find that a minority of users opt into keeping their cookies, albeit Apple's language is maybe a little bit scary, certainly relative to the sort of personalization ads kind of story that they tell consumers when they ask for the same consent for themselves. But yeah, maybe even then the number isn't radically different. So this is a question mark, and it depends on the implementation. This is, you know, eMarketer's guess of what that might look like. It's my you know, semi-informed opinion here, given that we don't know exactly what Google is going to do, is that this is probably a reasonable starting point to have in our minds.
Great. And here's another question from David from Epsilon. Will the Sincera dashboard end with your funded research? And we'd love to talk to you, David, I'm sure, right?
Well, if you would like to fund my research and fund the Digital Business Institute, we won't turn you away. No, I continue to collect this. I'm sort of doing this like a moth to a flame, just because I think that this is useful for the public discussion. This is hard for people to get their heads around. Having some numbers is helpful. So I plan to keep tracking this stuff for the foreseeable future, even though it's a giant pain in the butt.
Oh, fascinating information. Okay, well, with that, maybe we'll wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Thank you, Garrett, for such great content, great information, for bringing us up to speed on the great work you're doing. If anyone has any follow-ups, I think if you can see Garrett's LinkedIn, or you can find him on LinkedIn, find me on LinkedIn. My email is pjhoward@bu.edu. Happy to orchestrate any introductions and meetings with anybody who'd like to follow up. Thanks again. Appreciate it, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Pete, for organizing and moderating.
Of course.